My name is Jack Blaszkiewicz. I am a music history professor at Wayne State University, and I research music in 19th century Paris. Traviata is often called a realist opera. Musical realism is kind of an interesting thing, because how can music ever really represent real life? We don't walk around hearing music on a daily basis. So what Verdi did in Traviata is he tried to paint a portrait. When the opera was composed, he had 1840s Paris as his inspiration. Now, Verdi lived in Paris from 1847 onwards and off until his death. And while he was there, he always went out and went to the boulevard theaters. Now, at the theaters, he would often hear popular music, what we would today call maybe club music. And there are particular rhythms associated with that music. And the two rhythms that he really gravitated towards was the waltz rhythm and the polka rhythm. The waltz rhythm, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And the polka rhythm, ta 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 ta. There's a third rhythm that he also heard, which was becoming very popular in Paris in the 1840s, and that's the can-can. Ta 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 ta. Just to give you a famous one. We could hear all three of these rhythms in La Traviata. So the work is really tied to what Verdi heard in 1840s Paris. What's interesting about this being a realist opera is when you start to talk about the story. Verdi based the story on a play that he saw by Alexandre Dumas fils called The Lady of the Camellias, which in turn was based on a novel of the same name, which in turn was based on Dumas' real-life relationship with the courtesan Marie Duplessis. So we talk about realism, but what we're really talking about is a meta-story. A story based on a story, based on a story, based on a story. Verdi writes this opera for a Venice theater. The problem is that censorship prevented him from showing things like contemporary prostitution, which after all is what Violetta, the main character, is. She's a high-end courtesan. You can also call her an escort. So the action was moved to Paris circa 1700, which is, in music history terms, the heart of the Baroque era. Johann Sebastian Bach was 15 years old. So you have this disconnect between the story, which is supposed to be in the 1700s, and the music, which is clearly drawn from the 1840s. So we talk about Traviata as being a realist opera, but whose reality are we trying to understand here? The 1700s reality, or the reality that the music is telling you? The way that Verdi tried to evoke reality through music was by creating a sound world. The word that he used was tinta, which literally translates to hue, or think a color palette. So each of his operas, if you think of Rigoletto, if you think of Stifelio, La Traviata, they all have a different sound world, a different vibe, if you will. They draw on different types of rhythms and melodic structures. So with Traviata, he uses a lot of dance rhythms. And if you listen to Act 1, the dancing never stops. From the very first moment of the opera, it's all three-quarter time, it's all polkas, it's all can-cans. The music never lets up. So we can talk about realism as being what types of popular music might the characters on stage be listening to, and by extension, what the audience is hearing as well. We can also think about how Verdi would map speech patterns into music. Of course, opera is all about singing, in particular Italian opera. It's all about those beautiful melodies, those arias. But in Act 1, Violetta starts coughing. This is unprecedented in the history of opera, to have a character literally cough in the middle of the music. So this was another way of Verdi showing that this heroine is not just sick, she's symptomatic. And we can hear her symptoms over the course of the opera. And in a really interesting way, at the very, very end of the opera, when she is on her deathbed and she's surrounded by the penitent Germont, the father figure, Alfredo, the doctors, she has this final moment of lightness. She finally feels better. In medical terms, we're talking about terminal lucidity, that moment that people feel suddenly well right before they're about to pass away. And what does Verdi do? He really leans into that. He sets her music to this major key. She has this soaring final melody. And then finally the music drops back into minor. And we're back in the reality of the room with Violetta being held dead in the arms of Alfredo. Going back to the conversation about the music that Verdi was listening to and drawing on, the boulevard theaters, the way that music was presented in those theaters was, in musical terms, it's called a melodrama. So you had actors acting on stage like a play, but then you had an orchestra playing what is basically a soundtrack. The characters are not associating with that music, they're not singing. So the music is basically commenting on what's happening. And you see elements of melodrama in Verdi's score. That moment when Violetta is coughing, there's offstage music. It's a band playing the music of the dance in another room. So you have this moment of almost an audiovisual experience. The characters want to go back to a different room, but Violetta is kind of caught up and starts to cough. So she is kind of fighting Verdi's music in that moment. You're being ripped out of conventions and fantasy and into that real life scenario of, I can't continue, I need to tend to my own health. And the tragedy of Violetta is that she was never really allowed to tend to her own health. She's always caught up in her professional obligations, her romantic relationship, and what society wants from her. Traviata is still bound to operatic convention. And the way that Verdi plays with operatic convention is a really interesting look into how these issues of prostitution, of sickness were viewed at the time. Violetta is navigating a very complicated social environment, where on one hand, she wants to retain her freedom and her ability to practice her craft as a courtesan, but on the other hand, she wants that stability. She wants Alfredo, and she wants what Alfredo provides, which is a reputable relationship. So in some ways, you can read Violetta as wanting out of her situation, thinking about what we are led to think about Violetta. So La Traviata comes from the Italian verb traviare, which means to mislead or to lead astray. But the way it's conjugated into a noun means the one who is led astray, the one who is misled. I see this as a judgment on Verdi's part about Violetta. We're not led to conclude that she is doing things because she wants to, but rather that she went down the wrong path. And I think audiences need to think about the titles of operas like this, and to what extent is our characterization of Violetta already set in stone by the composer. We should feel free to push back against that as we listen and as we watch these works. In fact, it's interesting to remember that the original title of La Traviata was Amore e Morte, Love and Death, which would have been a much broader set of ideas to think about. But by calling it La Traviata, in some ways this was to please the Venetian censors by passing judgment on this woman who, after all, is a professional. We can talk about prostitution as being a reputable or non-reputable profession, but at that time, being a courtesan was a way out for lots of working class women from a very, very scary situation. And to be able to build yourself up into a lifestyle that is sustainable and, most importantly, safe. So when we think about who is misled in La Traviata, we have to think about whose gaze we are channeling here. If we only think about the opera characters from the gaze of their male authors, we're missing a whole element of the realism of this work. If you do not identify as a male, that will give you a completely different perspective on this work. And who is the one being misled, and how is the main character able to navigate through these various societal traps that are put in front of her over and over and over. The thing about Traviata, we know exactly what's going to happen from the very first measure. The prelude tells us that Violetta is going to die. We hear that music later in the opera. So why do we want to see a story whose ending we already know? Because we want to see how it plays out. We want to see, will they have at least one moment together? Will society, will her illness, will other factors come in the way, and to what extent will they come in the way? And I think that's what people really want out of television, film, and art. They want to see not just what the story is, but how that story plays out. And in particular, if you know how it ends, it makes it somehow even more tragic. If you're seeing La Traviata for the first time, ask yourself, do the characters really know what they want? Do you believe what they're telling you? Do you believe what they're telling themselves? The only character who gets to be alone is Violetta, but even she is fighting against those dance rhythms, and we hear that from the very beginning. So, are you really hearing an honest answer from her? Does she actually want to be free, as she proclaims famously at the end of Act 1? Is she actually saying goodbye to the world, as she does in her Act 3 aria, which, by the way, is also in 3/4 time? One moment to pay attention to is the Act 1 Brindisi, the drinking song. Alfredo starts off the toast, and then Violetta mirrors him. So this is an example of Violetta, who is the host, basically just mirroring what other people want her to say. So to what extent are we seeing or hearing the real Violetta, and to what extent are we seeing the front, the professional courtesan, performing for her audience? And these tensions continue throughout the opera.